I'm going to level with you. I have a feeling certain viewers are going to be disappointed with this rumination because I'm basically doing this in what has quickly become the lore runner format. You know, I'm going to talk about some gameplay stuff and some behind-the-scenes stuff, and then I'm going to talk about a couple of things about the setting, and then I'm going to talk about some characters, then the main character, then the villains, then the themes, and then I'm going to be done. I'm not going to discuss every tiny little side quest. I'm not going to forget to turn off my phone. I'm not going to, you know, really go in-depth into the game, because I kind of can't. Certain games like this, I can't actually do that with. And I hope this has been something you guys have acknowledged and understood over the years, because people are like, hey, I want you to look at this, you know, 40-hour game. Okay, and I produce an hour video about it. Because I'm not going to just sit down and recite every little thing about every little side quest. I'm not going to analyze every single tiny little nuanced detail of the thing. That's what lore runs are for. Okay, this is a rumination. And this is where I kind of summarize things and give my analysis on what I felt was worth talking about. And I stress that point. As ever, I don't pad my work. I don't limit my work. I talk until I run out of things to say. So, with that preface, let me go ahead and address the elephant in the room first thing. I mentioned back during, I think it was my Fallout 2 rumination, you know, right at the beginning I was like, I didn't really enjoy replaying this. Now, I didn't have the same problem exactly, but in many ways I had the same problem with this game. Oh, to clarify, I was playing the original version, aka the one I got off of GOG, as opposed to the enhanced edition or whatever it was that came out while I was actually playing the game for this rumination. I wasn't even aware of it until I'd already picked up the game for this rumination, and then people were like, oh, by the way, the enhanced edition coming out. I'm like, huh? Maybe that would have smoothed out some of the UI issues. I doubt it, because the Baldur's Gate enhanced editions didn't smooth out any UI issues, because they're basically just ports. That being said, I did, after I finished the game, decided to look into the enhanced edition, and I found it's the exact same damn thing they did with the Baldur's Gate series. So if you want a port, if you can't get the original game working on your computer, then yeah, go ahead and buy it. Otherwise, I can't recommend it, because there's no frickin' reason for it to exist. Moving on. So, the reason I wanted to start with this is because typically when CRPGs are brought up, this is at the top of the heap. You know, even amongst modern CRPGs. Of all the CRPGs that have come out over the years, this one is inevitably the one that sits at the very top. Everyone always constantly talks about how this is the best CRPG ever made. And some people say this is the best Western RPG ever made, period. Not sure I personally agree with that statement, but I could certainly see why so many people put it on such a pedestal. Now, I'm not saying I completely disagree with those people, but after having replayed it, for me personally, I think Arcanum edges it out a little bit, and I'm going to try and talk about why as we go through it. But what I want to really talk about is why I think so many people put it so far up. It's because of Final Fantasy IV. Hear me out. When Final Fantasy IV came out, you know, it basically started most of the typical concepts of a heavy story-based JRPG, or indeed a heavy story-based RPG in general, regardless of if it's Japanese or not. And a lot of other game developers and writers and games that came after that took those ideas and ran with them. Functionally speaking, you can look back and say FF4 is a fairly simply structured story. But it's not badly structured, it's just simply structured because it was basically the first game to really try and branch out that much, really have heavy character focus, really have heavy setting building, really have heavy thematic significance, etc. You can argue this left and right, but for me, FF4, if you ask my opinion, I would say FF4 is really the one that started carrying story-based RPGs into the future, my opinion. Now, of course, that's also debatable since there's certain PC games that came out around that era that started doing that. Some other console games started doing that as well. The point being, a lot of people hold FF4 up on a pedestal because it's the one that started all of that. You probably already see where I'm going with this. Because Planescape Torment is a deconstruction game. It's a game specifically and deliberately designed to challenge tropes and common mediums, and to look at what was considered at the time to be the default RPG mindset, and video game mindset for that matter, and just completely twist everything on its head. Structurally speaking, I found several characters I had very little to talk about because basically their character could be described as take what you were expecting, reverse it, and that is what the character is. Now I have some other thoughts about that, but that is basically this game in its overall concept. It was a deconstruction. It was an attempt to analyze these things and to try to do something different rather than the typical you saving the world. There is no big bad, really. Well, we'll talk about that towards the end, but there's no, I'm going to destroy the world. There's no plot to conquer the multiverse or take over Sigil from the Lady of Pain or threat against, you or Sigil itself, The Blood War, even though it's brought up consistently, is just kind of a background event that is a thing that has been going on basically forever and theoretically will be going on forever and therefore is also not part of that. No. This game is all about you and figuring out you. It is a very personal game. There's no big threat. There's no big villain, not really. It's all about character. It's all about really bringing the focus down to earth, which is funny, because the other thing they do is they go as weird as they possibly can. Once upon a time, I had a concept which nowadays I refer to as weird for weird's sake. I used to call it something less kind. People complained. I stopped calling it that. That took some effort because I'd been using that phrase since I was a kid. But, there's a lot of weird for weird's sake in this game, to be blunt. There are, and this is not me going into this. Many of the developers and many of the art directors and designers have flat out said they were trying to make things out there. They were trying to push the envelope. Okay, that's fine. But that right there is one of the biggest reasons why I've never really personally held Planescape Torment that high. Because every time I go back and replay it, it's like, ugh, I don't like weird. I don't like weird for weird's sake. I don't like wacky. I don't like the general presentation of that. I'm not saying this is a bad game, and I'm not saying I didn't enjoy it. But I did have some issues going through it, like I always do. And I tend to not hold Planescape Torment as high as some other people do. So now that I've gotten all that out of the way, if you want to no longer listen to the rest of my thoughts, that's totally valid, just like I prefaced Fallout 2 with that. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, this game, one thing I want to talk about really quick, actually. I mentioned there's no saving the world. There's also no good ending. You could argue if you really twist things, that things can turn out well if Grace comes and finds you during the Blood War. Yeah, right, by the way. But, that's really twisting it. There is no good ending here. I have noticed some people argue what the better ending is, though. But I kind of want to save that discussion for later. This game was made alongside Fallout 2. A lot of the development was being done while development on Fallout 2 was being done. A lot of the people who worked on this game also worked on Fallout 2. It kind of shows in many ways, mostly the good ways. As with most of the games I've been talking about over the last few weeks, this is yet another game in the All Roads Lead to Rome game design philosophy. There is a huge amount of variety in how you can proceed through quests. And one of the more interesting things, though, is that they play with that in a way that they never really have before. And yet at the same time, it's something they've always done. I know that sounds weird, but what I'm trying to say is, most of the other games I've talked about recently have allowed you to decide what kind of character you are. Your personality, your mindset, that kind of a thing. This one forces you to decide your personality. And it actually uses the standard D&D alignment grid in order to determine where exactly you sit on that scale. Because what you do and how you do it gives you chaos points, lawful points, evil points, or good points, and shifts you towards one of the four corners of the 9x9 grid. And so you decide that as part of a function of forced narrative. It's one of the weirder examples of it, because you construct yourself via others. And they do that in character. Again, a fairly typical deconstruction, but one of the first games to actually do this kind of thing. You, the character, have amnesia in the same way that you, the player, have amnesia, because you don't know your backstory. You're just Alright, I'm a new character. Ha-ha! You know, nowadays that's been deconstructed and moved in different directions, just like FF4 has its original ideas have been taken in all many different directions as well. But credit is still due for the fact that this game really kind of started trying new things and different things with regards to its narrative function. Because I want to get back to that point I mentioned earlier. You always, in games like CRPGs, you decide what kind of character you play, and with varying levels of limitations. But here, it's more like you are building a character out of the fragments of pre-existing characters, and you do it specifically as a reflection of the other characters around you. It's a weird example of internal choice versus external stimuli, because you, the player, are still choosing how you react to things and what you do, but the things around you are giving you the impetus to choose based on them. And it's very rare you see that kind of mixed airplane going overhead. I'm sorry. I'm trying to talk about narrative functions, and this morning has been a hell of a morning. I'm actually still tired. I did not sleep well last night. I'm sorry. I've been absolutely destroying myself trying to get through these monumentally huge games in time to be able to push out these ruminations, so forgive me. Let me drop big fancy words, and let me just say I like the fact that there is nothing in this game, with very few exceptions. We're talking like less than 4 or 3% of this game exists for its own sake. The other 90+% of this game is here about you. Not just your past incarnations and the fact... Oh, by the way, spoilers everywhere. Not just the fact that your past incarnations have been causing so many of the things that you are now seeing the ripple effects of, but in almost every single side quest, every NPC interaction, every loot, every fight, every boss battle you do has something to do with you. It all revolves around you. That's a distinction because, for example, the other game I praise that does a very similar thing is Dragon Age Origins. Hear me out for a second. In Dragon Age Origins, you typically have around 5 character choices in every single conversation, and I praised the hell out of this during my Dragon Age lore run series, because it allows you to not just choose your base personality, you know, fundamentals, but also shadings. Like, you can still be helpful, but you can be helpful, ha, or helpful, or helpful, you know, serious. You know, it allows you to choose nuance, and through your choices, you mentally can kind of build your character. It's kind of the same thing this game does, except in this game, the structure and the construction of your character is the entire point of the game. So unlike in Dragon Age Origins, where you were stopping the Blight and the many, many other things you were doing in that game, in this game you are figuring out who you are. Thus the entire point of every interaction, every side quest, is all in service of that point. So you always learn something new about yourself, even if it's something minor, even if it's just a fine shading of who you were and how you react to who you were, or something you're doing now and how you react to something you do now. It is all about constructing your character. In many ways, this entire game is basically building a fully fleshed out, fully realized, and fully developed character. And I love that. Then you die. Spoiler alert, no matter what you do, the ending is not fun. So let's talk about a couple other behind-the-scenes things. I mentioned this was being made alongside Fallout 2, and there's a lot of co-development things going on there. There's also a huge list. Like, they gave a list. Several of the developers and writers gave a list of things they were inspired by in making this game. It's gargantuan. I'm not even going to list any of it. It's just a huge list of other games and other books and other movies, all of which helped to inspire where they were going with this and what they were doing with this. Also some talented voice acting in this game, which is funny because it's actually one of the least voice-acted games of the CRPGs. I mean, Morte has a lot of lines, but most characters have relatively few by comparison. To be blunt, I never knew John Delancey was in this game because he only says like 5 things in the whole game, so it never really clicked with me. This is well after TNG, by the way. So, Obviously, this is basically set in your standard default D&D setting. Planescape itself, although Planescape kind of doesn't exist anymore. Not functionally, anyways. It's not being updated. At least last I checked. But the funny thing is, as with this is going to be a recurrent thing throughout this rumination. They looked at the default and said, okay, what can we do other than the default? Well, they looked at the default and all the many planes and all the different ways that all the different types of magic and races coexist with each other and said, well, what would happen to the statistical outliers? You know, you have millions of lives across thousands of years. Every now and again, you're going to get one guy or one girl who just doesn't fit with the norm. And it challenges that age-old adage, always chaotic evil. AKA, if you pull up a dungeon... Dungeons and Dragons Monster Manual, it'll usually say something under the Monster Manual entry like, always chaotic evil. Well, what about the statistical anomaly? That's kind of what a lot of the construction of Sigil in general is. Now, I know Sigil existed before Planescape Torment, and the Lady of Pain existed before Planescape Torment, but a lot of the characters you meet are those statistical anomalies, the people who slip through the cracks, the people who don't actually fit the norm. I'll be discussing a few of those as we go through this, but it also fits the setting in general. And it kind of goes back to that weird for weird's sake thing, because, well, again, by developer intent, they were trying to have things that were as far out there as possible. There's a reason why your first default companion is a floating talking skull. That's basically normal compared to most of the stuff you're going to encounter in this game. I mentioned the Blood War earlier. The Blood War is something that I'm not sure why they did this, but it serves as a non-stop backdrop to a huge number of actions. Not just the things about you and developing you as a character, and obviously you're kind of trying to avoid the Blood War, but a lot of the other characters here are either here as a result of the Blood War or are doing something regarding the Blood War. It's a very predominant backdrop event to a lot of what's going on at this point in time in Sigil. Now, I find myself wondering if that's just the norm. I mean, the Blood War's been going on forever, right? You'd figure that'd be a fairly upheaval-y kind of a thing. Or if that's just happening now because of things I'll get into later. Before I get more into the setting, though, I'm talking too much about the setting stuff. I want to talk about my perspective. So first of all, I just got to say it was really weird playing Fallout 2, which, as I said, I had difficulty with, and then Arcanum, which I had a few difficulties with and was pretty rough, but, you know, whoosh, yeah. And then going to this game, it was just like a weird in-between. I didn't have nearly as many UI issues as I did with Fallout 2, but I did still have issues, and I was still having trouble figuring out certain things and how to move certain things and stacking certain things, and just... I actually hate myself for admitting this, but I was stuck in the morgue right at the beginning for like 20 minutes. Because I couldn't figure out how to get out of it. I couldn't figure out what to do. And I'm like, okay, I'll talk to the zombies. Hey, zombies. Hey, no, of course, that doesn't actually mean anything. I mean, they're the dustmen, right? They don't care. So, okay, I'll attack the zombies. Yeah! Okay. How do I loot the zombie? And it's just, I kept running into these problems. After I got used to the swing of things, it's like, okay, I have a better idea of what I'm doing. But it's just this weird, just, it's like I'm constantly downshifting on the highway here, going between these games. But they did do a lot of things right and wrong with regards to the game. I've just got a bullet point list of notes here as I was going through. I just kept adding things. First of all, as far as right, gameplay and story integration. There is a huge amount of gameplay and story integration in this game. Very rarely will something happen in gameplay that doesn't have a story reason, and vice versa. One of the only exceptions I can think of off the top of my head is they basically had to nerf Grace, Fall from Grace, in a couple of ways, because otherwise she would be really overpowered compared to your other party members. And no explanation is ever given for why they nerfed her relative abilities relative to other succubi. And there's just like a couple of exceptions like that. Otherwise, everything has some kind of gameplay or story reason that affects the other side of it, which I love. I mentioned the no side quests being related to anything other than you, which is awesome. The other thing I want to mention is that there's... I think, if I may, one of the other reasons this game was so popular is because they took a lot of inspiration, again, from a lot of things, but specifically from Empire Strikes Back, which is, there's no shame in that because it's a very, very well-known film that has had an influence on an absolutely gargantuan number of people over the years, including me. But Empire Strikes Back's plot was very, very weak. It was, let's just be honest and admit it. Its main plot was very weak. It made up for that deficiency in basically every other way. Lots of world building, lots of character development, lots of character growth, lots of thematic significance. That's what this game does. It's like, alright, the plot is figure out who you are. And technically part of the plot is stop the Transcendent one. But I say technically because, as we discover, that's not even a plot. I mean, he's built up as if he's the big bad, but he really isn't. He is limited and getting more limited over time. He is on the downswing, not the upswing. And so our goal is to figure out who we are and figure out what we're going to do about that. That's the plot. Very weak, really. But oozes every other aspect of it. Which, so let's go ahead and talk about it. So that's the first bullet point. Second bullet point, the UI was so small. I mean, I know there are patches, and I was actually running a patch which literally increases the size of font and UI so it's easier to see. And I still had issues like, okay, where's my... There it is, click, you know. Graphics, however, interestingly enough, I feel the graphics of this game have aged much better than most of the other CRPGs that I've looked at recently. Unlike in, say, Fallout 2, where I occasionally would literally just not see an NPC because of the graphic situation, I never had that issue here. I could always tell where I was going, what I was doing, what I could interact with the exception of the first few minutes of the morgue. Like I said, kind of embarrassing. The Modrum Maze was actually one of the first things of its type in a game like this. I want to stress that because I know Daggerfall came out before this, and I know procedural generation existed before this, but the Modrum Maze was a procedurally generated maze in an Infinity engine, which actually, if I'm not mistaken, is the only time that's ever happened, since we don't use the Infinity engine anymore. I could be wrong about that, but I know it was new at the time, so that was actually pretty awesome. They've got a little bit of the Baldur's Gate 2 thing going on. Spells tend to be flashy, like really flashy. Probably my favorite example of this is actually when Ravel, excuse me, or is it Ravel? I actually don't remember, is fighting the Transcendent one. And the fight takes like 2 minutes because they're just like... You know, spell effects. I actually kind of appreciate that. It makes a mage feel stronger through, you know, the big flashy effects, which is kind of what you want. And the Infinity engine is actually, to be blunt, kind of limited when it comes to big flashy effects. So they did what they could to try and make them feel as powerful as they could. And again, I felt the same way in Baldur's Gate 2, for example. So I like that. They kind of make fun of the talk to everyone concept, because if you talk to everyone, it usually doesn't actually work out that great, and you'll actually end up fighting several people because they're all like, hey! But of course, oh, excuse me, you are still encouraged to talk your way through almost every circumstance. Near as I can tell, and I've seen some disagreeing information on this, but there are roughly 4 mandatory fights in this game. 4 fights you cannot avoid fighting. Everything else, you can either talk your way around, sneak your way around, or find some other way in order to get through things. I bring up that last point on purpose because, well, I mean, most of what I'm doing is on purpose right now. But I do that on purpose because one of the biggest complaints I've heard about the recent Torment game is because is that there's so little combat in it. Like, there's no combat in the recent Torment game, and it's like a weird thing that only happens occasionally. And I've heard a lot of people complain about that. Boilerplate. God, I am really tired. Boilerplate. I haven't played the recent Torment game, so I don't actually have, you know, the ability to speak of that personally. But maybe I'm just missing something, but I never fought a lot in Planescape Torment, the original. I was one of those people who was like, oh, this is awesome, being able to talk my way through things. You remember when it was considered such a rare and unusual thing that you could talk down the final boss in Fallout 1? That game and this game are the two that I used to talk with my friends about and just jazz with my friends about back in the day, that you could talk your way through the game rather than fight your way through the game. In fact, I actually brought it up with my mum, too, Lore Mum, because she has never really liked the prevalence and predominance of violence in video gaming, and that's a whole other topic I don't want to get into right now. I don't mean like, she's not one of those people who's like, oh my god, you get violent video games. She was just like, why aren't there more video games that don't involve violence? And I actually kind of agree with her reasoning on that one. But again, that's another topic that I want to get into. So this is one of those games I like to bring up to her and be like, look, you can just talk your way through this game. And she's like, oh, that's awesome. And she actually played a little bit of it, couldn't figure out the UI, and then put it back down. This is back in the day. Anyways, let's talk about Sigil. So obviously this is set in Planescape, where belief kind of forms reality, which is something I don't like. I'm just going to go ahead and just bluntly lay that out there. I don't like that usage in fiction, where you can literally create this guy named Adrian, or whatever his name is, just by using his name a lot. You know, little things like that. I've never liked that concept, being able to discuss someone out of existence, you know. Okay, I get it, whatever. But it's funny because one of the 3 rules of Sigil is the rule of 3, that everything tends to come and happen in 3s. And one of the reasons, or actually I would say the reason why the rule of 3 exists, is because everyone knows the rule of 3 exists, so everyone kind of continues to perpetuate the rule of 3 thanks to their interactions with everyone around them. So they notice patterns of 3, and therefore obviously 3 things, and 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. Now, one of the things I also want to praise about this game is something I praised about Final Fantasy VI somewhat recently in one of my Keeping Perspective videos. Amnesia. Now, we as gamers are so used to the whole amnesia trope that it's become a cliche, and many people are like, ugh, oh god, I've got amnesia again. And I am one of those people as well. I tend to look at the amnesia thing like, ugh. It is very rarely, therefore, that I notice that they actually use amnesia properly, and I tend to praise it when they use amnesia properly as a resultant, and this is one of those examples. The only weird thing about that is the fact that we don't have amnesia after dying this time. I want to bring that up really quick here, because why do you think that is? To my knowledge, they never actually state outright why you maintain your memory through deaths in this particular incarnation, in this particular iteration. Now, yes, I know about the whole, you know, in 3 more deaths, he will start remembering himself prophecy thing that was given to, I think, the Paranoid one. But no actual explanation is given. So what's your thoughts? Why do you think it is that we maintain it, other than the fact that we're the player character, obviously? Now, there's several possible answers there. It could be that Ravel had been arranging something. It could be that the Transcendent one is starting to make moves, and that's affecting us, allowing us to maintain a better sense of self. It could be that we only lose our memory if we die a particular type of death, and so none of the deaths we encounter actually are like that. I mean, it's worth noting, we can permanently die despite the ending of this game, too. We are not actually immortal, which is, by the way, another thing I like about this game. You know, one of the selling points, if you will, is the fact that, you can't die, right? You go back and end up at the morgue or whatever. And in fact, you can willingly die in order to progress yourself through certain quests, and have to, through several main quests of this game. You have to die in order to be able to figure out certain things, like, you know, don't trust the skull, for example. But why do you... My biggest answer, my personal theory on the matter, is that we have basically reached a point at which the connection between the Transcendent one and the current incarnation, the Nameless one, is so strong that we are... This was going to be our final incarnation. That this is it. That everything and everyone... Again, in a setting where belief literally makes things reality, we are no longer capable of becoming another incarnation, and therefore, any times we die at this point in time, we remain ourselves because this is our final incarnation, kind of a self-fulfilling sort of a loop. I know that's kind of a boring answer, but it's the answer I've got. one of the things I mentioned earlier, that deciding who and what we are. Actually, before we get into that, let's talk about the immortality thing. I like the way our immortality thing works. First of all, it's not real immortality. We just heal very quickly and we get back up. And the life energy that supports us comes from someone else, specifically someone innocent, of the particular plane we are on. Now, I mentioned that very importantly because there are certain circumstances in which we will die permanently. Para exemple, if we actually die in the Fortress of Regret, we frickin' die, because there's no one we can eat any life energy from, or any life energy that would go through there would naturally go into the plane of negative material plane. So either way you interpret it, we can't actually have that power there. So we're not actually literally immortal. We're not Superman. We just have a unique trick that enables us to keep going. And there are ways around that trick. Probably my favorite way is, let's just toss us into the plane of fire, because then we'll just be, get up, get up, which reminds me of that time I was playing Skyrim. But anyways, and there's other ways around it, of course. The Lady of Pain can just you out of existence if she wants to, because she's the Lady of the Pain, and she can do that. Or they can do that if she actually is the squirrels. And there are certain beings that if you piss off enough... I actually wrote down one of their names. What was his name? Dargoth? Lothar. There he is. Lothar is an excellent example of someone who can just permanently kill you because he has enough understanding of magic and reality to do that. But what I like best is the cost of immortality, because it's one of those typical Avalon tricks. It's, here, have a toy. Oh, sweet. And the natural inclination of most players, and Lord knows this applied to me too when I first played this game, so I'm not trying to stand on a high horse or anything here, but the natural inclination of most players is once they are given a tool in a video game, or a game in general actually, board game, tabletop, card game, they try to utilize and exploit that tool pretty much to the furthest extent. How far can I use this? To what extent can I use this? And so I and many other players would just go around dying all willy-nilly to find all the stuff. And there's a lot of stuff you can do and a lot of content you can see specifically by dying. And then he reveals the cost of dying. And that's when it's like, oh. And you don't find that at the end. You find that out towards the end, where it's like, okay, damn. All right. And then there's an actual gameplay cost for that, because, now you have to fight more of the shades once you get to the Fortress of Regret. And the shade incidents become worse as a consequence. But for anybody who's actually a role player who actually cares about the lore of the setting, it makes you feel even worse, because you've basically been killing innocent people left and right, ignorantly, but still deliberately. Yeah. Very cute. Very horrible. Here's a question for you. How guilty do you think your current self is? The current incarnation, the nameless one. I have a slightly related question to that. How much of you are you? This is one of those questions that people debate, and some people have differing opinions on. I like how they basically leave it up to us to decide here, because it's pretty clear that the original incarnation, the paranoid incarnation, and the practical incarnation are different entities. Oh, and the transcendent one. All are different entities. But we get to decide how much of any of those we are. It goes back to, if I may, there's an episode of Babylon 5 called Passing Through Gethsemane, which is one of my favorite episodes. And one of the most important points to be made of that episode is, was Brother Edward the same as, I can't remember his original name. Were those the same people? Same soul? Because soul actually matters in a setting like Torment, or Planescape rather. Is it the same soul? Is it the same mind? Is it the same personality? In the ways that matter to you, because you make this decision, is it the same person as the original incarnation? Are you the same person? And that, of course, kind of naturally leads to all other questions after that, because you have to define that before you can define guilt or innocence or regret or any kind of judgment whatsoever. You have to determine who before you can determine what. For me, of course, I think of the the nameless one, the recent incarnation, as a completely different entity in every way that matters. Completely separate individual from the original, which makes the final thing kind of horrific in its own way, because it means that you are punished for the crimes of someone else. Now, I've made my opinion very clear on the whole sins of the father concept and how much I adamantly disagree with that. However, it is a very prevalent concept, especially in the ridiculously unfair D&D setting. And I just say D&D generically because, you know, we're Planescape, right? And, I mean, Greyhawk, I don't think is even going anymore at this point. So, it's not about fairness at that point. We can decide if it's fair or not. I personally don't think it's fair that you get you automatically get judged based on what what is effectively a separate entity did. But one thing I find interesting is that you are caught instantly. The moment you are you again, you are returned to your original mortal self, they find you in seconds and drag you down to fight in the Blood War as your punishment for whatever we did as the original incarnation. Which brings me to my third question about the Nameless One. What do you think we did? Now, there's some hints here or there, and these are very vague hints, that we did something that was literally destabilizing the planes themselves, which is a pretty big deal. But I don't actually... it's never said definitively, at least in this. Now, yes, I know there's the novelization, which I'm not even going to refer to, by the way, because it kind of contradicts the game in several ways. Just looking at the game here. So within the confines of the game, what do you think we did that was so horrible? What do you think we did that affected this so much? Just leaving that question open there. I already mentioned Sigil, the metaphysical, the weird. I only have a brief thought about the Lady of Pain. And the only thing I want to say there is I personally adhere to the theory, which I believe is still unproven at this point, that Sigil is actually her prison. That she did something forever ago, probably to Ao, given the kind of setting we're dealing with here. And as a consequence, the Lady of Pain was sealed within Sigil. And that would kind of explain how she acts the way she does and why she reacts the way she does and why she keeps such a tight grip on certain aspects of Sigil. I also have always found it a little head-tilting given the reality-bending way she can just kind of do things. However, if Sigil is truly hers, then that makes sense. I mean, within the rules of D&D, if you are in your plane, a subdimension that you have crafted or has been crafted for you, then you basically have total control there. So, I mean, that makes a degree of sense. Anyways, I don't have much else to talk about her. I already talked about Lothar. I don't actually have much else to say there. I only bring up Lothar right next to the Lady of Pain because those are two of the ways to get a non-standard game over, aka to actually permanently die, regardless of other actions. Oh, I actually forgot to bring up one other thing about the Nameless One, so forgive me. Towards the end, you are given a choice to suffer eternally in the Blood War. Or, wait, no, I'm actually... Sorry, I'm actually going to bring that up later. I'm sorry, I really am tired. I apologize. Let's talk about Dayanara. Or Dayanara. I actually don't remember how to pronounce it. Jennifer Hale, damn it. The Ghost Lady. So here's a question for you. Do you think I've thought of three options here. Do you think her love for the practical incarnation was real true love, which I'll define in a second? Do you think it was blind stupidity, which I imagine the vast majority of you do? Or do you think that she was in love with the concept of being in love? That the romanticized notion of Twu Wuv was so appealing to her that she adhered to it to the point of obsession and therefore isn't actually in love with us. She's just adhering to what she believes love should be. You can probably tell by the way I'm saying this which of these I think it is. And I adhere to the third option. But I want to talk about that first option really quick. Because the concept of true love does exist within fictional settings like this one. Whether it exists in real life is debatable, which is why I say that way. I'm not saying it does or does not exist in real life. But in fiction, we can define such things. We can define concepts and whether or not they are true or not. And in the setting of Planescape and in the setting of D&D in general, true love does and can exist. The reason I bring that up is it goes back to that who we are question. Because to put this as succinctly, as clearly as I think I can, I in no way think that she loved the practical incarnation. But I think it is at least possible that she loved the original incarnation. Or the current incarnation, the nameless one. Because for whatever you have to say about how things went, the fact is she still remained loyal even when we weren't us anymore. And this isn't a Doctor Who kind of a situation. We don't have memories from our previous self, not until we regain them. So we are not the practical incarnation in every way that matters. However, she still binds herself to us, which is why I think it's actually the third one. But what I'm saying here is the possibility exists if it's the same soul being passed down, if we are the same entity in core, if not in reality. In other words, we have the same different flowers on the same bush. I think that's the way I'd put it. We all have the same roots, we all have the same general core trunk or whatever, but different flowers blossoming from the same source. In other words, using that analogy, she might have been in love, true love, with the bush, not the flower. And there's some merit in that thought process, especially since she does end up making things work out, and then, by all accounts, is enabled to pass on as a result of finally fulfilling that, and us letting her go, for that matter. Let's talk about Ravel. First of all, I'm just going to bring up the obvious. It has been flat out stated that Ravel's shards, her little pieces of her, are something that they've been kind of inserting as basically cameos in other games for some time since. The most obvious ones are the ones in the Icewind Dale series, but... And this is confirmed, this is not me theorizing. Kreia from KOTOR 2 is one of those. And actually, I think I knew that, and I just forgot it. But when I reread that, I was just like, I was rereading the interview from Avalon, and I'm like, oh, that makes perfect sense. Because they're not actually her. They just have some essences of her. It's a weird whole thing. But anyways, she is, of course, a perfect hag. They perfectly encapsulate hag mindset, hag culture, the idea of, how what she considers to be a positive thing is not what we consider to be a positive thing. And so she says things like doing good and whatnot is actually something that leads to bad, or something that she doesn't enjoy. And the way she defines love is certainly unique, I would say. But one other thing I find interesting is that it is implied that she is damned strong, that she has more than the capacity to do all sorts of things. Basically started this whole situation by making us immortal. Didn't quite know what she was doing at the time. The horrible irony. Alright, who am I? Okay, memories restored. Oh god, my second wish is to get rid of my memories. Alright, what's your third wish? Who am I? That's just messed up. Anyways, one of the things I feel in some ways she was that introduce a character type of characters. In other words, one of the things you can do in fiction is you can build someone up and then have them defeated by someone else to, through this inversion absence, demonstrate how powerful this other individual is. And as I mentioned earlier, when the Transcendent one shows up, he just absolutely destroys her. Although it's funny because she mentions that we might have been able to do that as well. And it's also referenced that we're basically level 20 in every class, which it may not sound like a big deal, but by classic D&D terms, especially 2nd edition, which this game was based on, that's insane. So, yeah. As an aside, I like the fact that as we level up, we're just remembering stuff that we already knew from previous incarnations. But anyways, I don't have much else to say about her, so I'm going to move on. Let's talk about Trias and Fall from Grace. Now, I mentioned these two alongside each other because I don't have too much to say about either of them. Trias is, of course, interesting because he's one of those obvious things once you think about it, but it's presented in such a standard video gamey way, so that we're basically encouraged not to think about it. Hey, here's an angel. Oh, God, help me do this. Yep, yep. And he's lying out his ass. He lies constantly. He is a lying, scheming, manipulative, arguably evil angel. Yeah, because, you know, everything's... Outliers. We talked about this already. He's also voiced by John Delancey, which, again, I didn't even know until this playthrough. I'm an idiot, apparently. But what's funny is, by D&D alignment standards, he doesn't qualify as evil. But I would call him evil because, first of all, he has a goal in mind, and that is to take out the lower planes, to deal with this whole blood war situation. There's another tie to the blood war concept. And his purpose, his reasoning is that anything I do to accomplish that is acceptable. You know, it doesn't matter the cost. It doesn't matter what happens. It may be some horrific atrocity, but it doesn't matter because the goal is so overwhelmingly valuable that everything else absolutely pales in comparison to it. Now, obviously, the people back home didn't agree with that because he is a fallen angel, despite what he may say. But yeah, that's just my take on it. But then we have Fall from Grace, who is a succubus, who is chaste and who is intelligent and kind and wise and actually belongs to a philosophical order. Did I write it down? I don't remember the name of it. It's one of the orders. I don't remember the name of it. She belongs to a philosophical order whose whole purpose is to seek out new experiences, which kind of helps to explain why she is the way she is. It is implied in the game that her torment is the greatest of all. I'm not sure I agree with that concept, though. I think it's more accurate to say that her torment... She is the character who most knowingly brings her torment upon herself, because she does so through willful, deliberate, constant action. She wants to effectively suffer in this matter in order to pursue that which she seeks. And she's also badass and awesome, and probably my favorite companion who is not Morte. So let's talk about Anna, of course. Anna, the tiefling, who is pretty much the frickin' opposite of Grace, and deliberately so. Deliberately inspired by, I think, Betty from Archie Comics. That's been acknowledged. That's not me making that up. Grace would be Veronica, or vice versa. I forget which, to be honest, because I don't remember which one is which in Archie Comics. But one of them is one of them. A lot of these characters feel, in many ways, going back, looking retrospectively back at them, like typical BioWare characters, but I don't mean that as an insult. I don't want to stir up the pot here, but once upon a time, you know, typical BioWare characters was a golden seal of awesome, because a typical BioWare character was a fleshed out, well-developed, interesting character with layers and fat masks and all that sort of stuff. So Anna is a typical character of the, I have been through hell, I have lived in unpleasant circumstances all my life, and been around people who are unpleasant all of my life, and I am trying to just muddle through and constantly have up huge defenses to deal with that situation. You know, there are layers to her, and you can kind of work your way through those layers and learn more about her, and, of course, learn more about yourself as a consequence. And she's also... I mean, it's funny because with the whole bitter, jaded cynicism thing she has going on, there's two things about that I find interesting. First of all, her association with the Dustmen, who are pretty much all about removing passion from their lives. By contrast, she seems to exemplify passion, to try and be more emotional, more expressive than she might otherwise be, which actually makes sense to me, given that company. But the other thing I find interesting is her association with Farad. Now, I don't like Farad, and I actually have very little to talk about him, so I'm just going to mention him in brief and then move on. But he dies, and his skull ends up in the pillar, right? What I find interesting is if you bring Anna to the pillar, she is actually upset to see him in there. I mean, he tries to get out briefly, and is like, no, no. That's interesting to me, since by all accounts, he was a terrible father to her. And he wasn't even a father, actually. He raised her as her boss, basically. And in every way strikes me as someone that she should not care about, because he never really cared about her. And yet, she expresses that remorse about that. Now, to me, that actually makes sense, because with the possible exception of the Nameless One, depending on player actions, of course, who else does she have to care about? And that's a fairly common theme, if we're being blunt, because one of the prevalent themes of this game is emotional abuse. And this is actually something I do like very much about the game. I know that sounds weird, but what I mean by that is, in my opinion, too many people in real life seem to look at emotional and mental abuse, whether it be through a workplace, or through a relationship, or through a connection, friendship, family, as if it's not a big deal. It only matters if physical injury is done. And I cannot possibly disagree with that sentiment more. And one of the predominant themes that this game analyzes many, many times is emotional and mental abuse, and the consequences of that, and how it messes with people, and how it ruins people, and how it breaks people. And I do like that, because that's exactly how it works in real life, and that's how it should be showcased. It shouldn't be made out to be, it doesn't really matter, as long as there's no hitting going on, you know, it's not really a big deal. What the hell is wrong with you? No. And so in my mind, Anna and her torment has to do with the fact that she basically has no one, and that she is clinging to people who she shouldn't because she has no one. Yeah. Dakan, I have a little bit to talk about. First of all, I think frickin' Githzeri, I swear to God. We had this problem with Neverwinter Nights 2 as well. Know that I will know the knowing by your... Still, very useful person to have in your party. Almost as useful as Morte. Not quite, though. What I find interesting about him is that there's two aspects of him that revolve around his character and inform his character and his character arc. One is his faith, which I'll actually talk about second, so I shouldn't have said that. So one is his enslavement to you. Now, for those of you who don't actually know Githzeri culture or their concepts, let me just go ahead and say that enslavement is really, really, really bad culturally for them. Now, that may sound kind of funny to say that, because most modern people would probably say that slavery is very, very bad. But, of course, as we know, especially in fictional settings, slavery tends to be semi-common, and that is very true in D&D. But the Githzeri, oh... And that this has to do with the whole Illithid thing and the whole separation thing. Let's not get into that right now. But the whole... That is actually relevant, because the second... Or, excuse me, hang on. The reason he's so upset about this is he was basically tricked into eternal enslavement to you, or whatever incarnation you happen to be. The Practical did that, and you can be an absolutely evil dick about that if you want to, and just really make him just twist that knife constantly in there as hard as you can. I don't do that, of course. By the way, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but this game lets you be really, really sadistically evil. So badly, in fact, that I've never actually done that. Ever. I mention that because anybody who knows me and knows my work knows that the time I officially quit being evil in games was KOTOR 1, Mission Vow. That's all I'm going to say about that. And that was officially the moment at which I just finally, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. It's like, no, I'm never doing this again. But I have played evil characters prior to then. But when I say evil, what I actually mean is destructive. I actually talked about this back in Arcanum, actually. I usually played destructive characters, which in D&D terms was typically chaotic evil. And I would do that because, you know, it was a venting mechanism. I'm sure most people could understand that. But every now and again I would come across a game that would let me be sadistically, horrifically evil, and I would never do that, and this game is an example. When I first played Planescape Torment back in the day, I'm like, oh my god, why is that an option? At several points in the game. Anyways, but the thing is, I bring this up because I've heard some people say that this is Dakan's great torment. No. His great torment is his faith. The thing that really bothers him is his faith and his wavering belief system. See, he's got this whole faith about the truth of what exactly happened with the Githzeri and the Githyanki, and whether or not the Illithid were involved in that split. It's actually a fairly complicated affair, which I can only cover the surface of without really going into the backstory of who exactly the Githyanki and the Githzeri are, the old Illithid situation, what exactly the Illithid are, what the Githzeri were, etc., etc. So, suffice to say There was a major cultural shift that happened many years ago. That was such a shift that the two groups that departed effectively consider themselves separate species from each other. And it happened as a consequence of one individual, whose name I actually don't remember right now, who may have been influenced by the Illithid to do so. And that is the source of his torment, his uncertainty, his anxiety about that. And you can actually help him through that. And, of course, he gets stat bonuses like everyone else does. There's Nordum. I only bring him up because Nordum is probably the textbook example of what I'm talking about with the inversion character concept. So we have a race of purely ultra-lawful characters who are super-duper lawful. They're from Mechanus. And that's it. That's like there's nothing else there. We are lawful, and they're all part of the one cohesive group mind. But then there's this one guy who isn't. He is the exact opposite. He has freedom of will, and is self-determined, and is the outlier, just like so many other characters are. He's literally called Nordum, as opposed to Modron. Think about it. Anyways, let's talk about Morte. Now, I love Morte. He is, without a doubt, my favorite character in this game, and I don't think I'm alone in thinking that. But Morte is also a typical BioWare character. He is the Alistair, to use the simplest parallel. He is lighthearted and silly and jokes and laughs, and oh, by the way, he also has a very serious side, and he's constantly masking what he's really feeling, and he is constantly plagued with regret, doubt, and general horror for all that he has done and all that he has continued to do. He remains loyal to you through basically everything out of a sheer sense of guilt and regret for what he has done in the past, arguably more than once. He also owes you quite a bit because of what the practical did for pulling him out, but he's been around since the beginning. Morte is the only guy who's really been around since the beginning, and that regret is this horrific weight upon him. And he lies constantly, and yet, oddly enough, also tells us a lot of truth by the method through which he lies. This is another reason I call him a typical BioWare character, because a lot of effort was clearly put into his lines and his dialogue, the exact wording of his sentence structure and the word choices and what he says and how he says it. And I like that. He's a great character, and there's a lot of depth and a lot of layers to him. In fact, one of the funniest things is as soon as you find out, don't trust the skull, which he didn't read off the tattoo, of course, one of the first things you can do is confront him out of it, and he says, no, you can trust me. And then you have to decide if you do or not. No other information, just that's up to you. Me, I trusted him, because as weird as this sounds, as much as he is a liar, he is not particularly deceitful. I know that sounds weird, but it's true. He actually has fairly pure motives. His motive is regret. And that brings me nicely back to you, the player character. Because all of these characters are drawn to you. This is something that KOTOR 2 will use in a different concept, but you can see the similar parallels in terms of narrative concept. Because all these characters are quite literally, metaphysically drawn to the player character, to the nameless one, because of that wonderful little rune you've got on your back, or shoulder, or wherever it is. The rune of Torment. Now, usually when I talk about these games, I talk about the theme, like the themes of the game. And one of the things I tend to do, I hate myself for admitting this, but this is true. I usually try to really dig deep into a work to see if there are obvious themes and undercurrent themes. Because it's my opinion that most people who analyze and discuss these works, either in written form or in vlog form or whatever, usually only look at the obvious themes. They don't actually dig deeper to find the undercurrent themes behind a work. And so it's like finding a little nugget of gold. It's like, aha, yes, that's the connecting point. That's the narrative web that interacts with all other parts of this work and binds it together, But I don't think there actually is that in this game. I don't mean that as a bad thing. It's just no matter how much I looked and no matter how much I went through it, the theme of this game is torment. It's right there on the cover. It's right there on the title, The theme of this game is torment. Now, it analyzes that theme thoroughly. The different types of torment, the different things that can be torment to different people, What is one person's delight is another person's, torture, that kind of a concept. I mean, just look at Ignis, for God's sakes. Who you notice I didn't talk about. I'm actually going to talk about him in a second. And most importantly, what people do as a consequence of that torment. Because some people are brought low by it, and some people charge against it, and some people just kind of slowly wilt away, and some people allow that to build over time. There's lots of different reactions that the characters have with regards to whatever it is that is tormenting them in particular. The Transcendent one's torment is probably the most obvious. He is a being that, despite all his ridiculous levels of power, is immeasurably contained. He is just locked away within the Fortress of Regret, barely able to leave it, and doomed to die out no matter what he does. Literally no matter what, he is doomed in the classical sense. Every time you die, he basically gets weaker. And even if the game, even if this wasn't the game and events just kept going on for a few years or decades or centuries, eventually he would just woof out, and that would be the end of it. His torment is the simultaneous rage of his imprisonment and his powerlessness while being so incredibly powerful. I actually feel pretty bad for the Transcendent one. That being said, of course, he does have a little bit of a... He's not, I'd say, the best written of the major villains we've encountered. President Richardson or Kurgan, for example. But I do like how, despite his presentation as your typical loud, deep voice, Tony J, by the way. Can I get a round of applause for frickin' Tony J? He is awesome as ever. You may recognize him from the Legacy of Kain series, if nothing else. But he comes across as someone who is fully aware of his own faults and flaws, and is so afraid of them that he refuses to even acknowledge them. That even when you bring them up to his face, he's like, no, I'm not listening. I'm not listening. You're wrong. You're wrong. That brings me to the Paranoid incarnation. Because the Paranoid incarnation is funny in his own right. In many ways, most of the game would not have happened the way it happened if not for the Paranoid incarnation. I suppose this is a source of irony, because after everything Practical did, which I'll talk about in a moment, Paranoid tried so hard to undo all of that out of base fear and nothing else, really, just a root cause of terror, and trying desperately to not have to undergo what was going to him, and having... Imagine for a moment that you have one really true, terrifying fear. This may not be hard to imagine. You may have such a thing, and in which case, you don't have to necessarily think about it. What I want you to think about is, now imagine that you've always defended yourself against that fear with the thought that it's not actually going to happen. This is also probably pretty easy for you to do, because most of us who have really, really terrible fears don't have to face those fears on a regular basis. It's like, yeah, that's never going to happen, and we always defend ourselves against that fear with that phrase. It's never going to happen. All right, now it happened. Boom! And that's kind of what happened to Paranoid. And it helps to inform so much of his actions and so much of what he did and why. And all of what he was doing was trying to undo the... he, knowingly or otherwise, undid so much of the Practical's work. Now, Django, who's one of my viewers, made a very interesting point that I loved. And I loved the way he phrased this. There's no doubt that the Transcendent one is the antagonist of this story. As I said, the plot is fairly small. But the Transcendent one is not trying to conquer worlds or alter reality or... do anything that villains are usually trying to do. In point of fact, he's probably more than anything simply trying to exist, which is funny because that's also our goal, but moving along. So, he's the antagonist, but who is the villain of this work? Yeah, no, it's the Practical incarnation. I have actually heard people argue, I have heard this, legitimate, and during my research I've heard this, that the Practical incarnation is just willing to do what's necessary. A renegade perspective, if you will, from Mass Effect. Not evil, simply, willing to do what is necessary. I don't agree with that. The practical incarnation is horrifically, unforgivably evil. He is, I would say, a fairly classic example of Type 3 evil. In other words, the kind of smug snake who feels absolutely no remorse whatsoever for what he does. He might also be a Type 4 villain. I'd have to actually debate that now that I think about it. He might be more of a Type 4 villain. But either way, no remorse. No nothing. All that matters to him is the results and himself. Utterly and universally selfish. Does not care about anyone or anything else other than what they can do and be for him. And was a manipulative, lying bastard who tortured physically and mentally and emotionally dozens and dozens of people just to better himself and for no other purpose or cause. Yeah, I'm sorry. I can't agree with that. For me, the practical incarnation is the real villain of this work, even more so than the original incarnation and whatever the hell he originally did. I want to share one thing that I had never actually seen before, because you have to trigger a specific memory with regards to Ignis. I told you I'd bring him up. Ignis, of course, likes fire. As a ironic punishment, they opened up a portal to the plane of fire in him, so he's constantly on fire, and he thought this was awesome. Yeah, so he's basically not even a person anymore, really. And when he was still young, a supplicant, if you will, the practical incarnation was training him. And you can see, basically from a first-person perspective, just how horrific you were training him. Like, for example, he says, no, I dreamed of this flame, and you're like, no, you burned yourself with a candle. No, I dreamed it. It was the dream master. Okay. Grab his hands, shove his hands into the fire. No, this is flame. Do you feel this? You have to be burned by power to use it. Feel the fire. And just burning his hands off, charring and melting and bubbling his skin. And it's pretty much just as horrific as you're thinking. That's one example of what the practical incarnation did. And I would say not the worst. But I bring all this up because, for me, one of the things that I find most interesting, and this is the closest thing to an undercurrent I came up with in this work, is the theme of torment is present in every character. Transcendent one has fairly obvious torment. The paranoid one, the incarnation, has fairly obvious torment. The original incarnation, fairly obvious torment. Ravel, all your party members, just about everyone involved, the torment is obvious. The one I find most interesting of all is the practical incarnation, who has no torment. Nothing bothers the practical incarnation. Nothing matters to the practical incarnation other than himself. In my opinion, because this is debatable, the practical incarnation was the one who never had torment, because the only way to be tormented is to care about something. And as much as he obviously cared about himself, there was so much self-assuredness and so much self-righteousness about what he was doing and how he was going about it. And he was just so meticulously, yep, I got this, and I'll just do this, and I'll just do this. It's why, in my opinion, he's called the practical incarnation, as opposed to the hideously evil incarnation. Because to him, he wasn't being evil or good. Neither mattered to him. Utter amorality. All that mattered was results. Now, the other possible side of that is that his biggest torment was the possibility of failing. Failing to succeed, failing to accomplish for himself. But I like the former idea better because it narratively makes him the villain. It makes him the one piece that doesn't fit with the rest of the narrative framework. It makes him the scissors to the fabric of the story. And I love the idea that, thematically speaking, the practical one is so wrong, for lack of a better word to use, that he doesn't even carry with him the predominant recurring theme of the entire rest of the work, including the main character, no matter how you play yourself. That's all I've got for Planescape Torment. I hope you've enjoyed this CRPG month, or however long this has been. we've got another sort of pseudo CRPG coming up, but after this we're going to be moving on to our next bundle. So I will see you guys next time.